Hey everyone, I'm HarvestBuildDestroy, and in this video I want to talk about Longswordsmen in the Castle Age. Longswordsmen have received a number of buffs in the HD expansions. Their HP was increased by 5 to 60, their attack bonuses versus buildings and eagle warriors were increased, and the arson technology was introduced. Several of the new civilizations have infantry bonuses as well. This got me thinking, are Castle Age Longswordsmen finally viable for civilizations other than the Goths? Let's start by taking a look at when we usually see swordsman line units in a typical game of Age of Empires, and try to figure out why we see them when we do. There are typically two stages of the game where we might see swordsman line units. The first is in the late Dark to early Feudal Age, in the form of the Drush or the Men-at-Arms Rush. If you're unfamiliar, a Drush or Dark Age Rush is a common competitive build order in which players delay their Feudal Age advance time in order to produce a small handful of early militia and harass their opponent, usually to buy time to advance to the Castle Age early. A Men-at-Arms Rush generally involves clicking up to the Feudal Age earlier and producing militia while you advance. Upon reaching the Feudal Age, you research the Men-at-Arms upgrade and harass your opponent while you transition into archer play. Aside from these early rushes, you typically won't see swordsman line units until the late game when the map is starting to run out of gold. This is because champions have a low gold cost and do very well against trash units. The only other point in the game that we might see swordsman line units in standard play would be in the early Imperial Age to take advantage of a power spike, particularly for civilizations with infantry bonuses. For example, an Aztecs player might research Garland Wars, plate mail armor, and two-handed swordsmen right upon hitting the Imperial Age and make a push. But even so, this sort of thing is a lot less common. So why do we tend not to see these units in between early Feudal and late Imperial? To explain this, I think it's important to understand why we see them there in the first place. Ultimately, the reason the Drush and Men-at-Arms Rush are so effective is that they are the only units you can make at that stage of the game. They are literally the only game in town. Their high food cost would delay your castle time too much if you were to continue producing them past this point in the Feudal Age, they're easily denied by quick walls, and they can't get anything done once your opponent has a handful of archers anyway. One of the core dynamics of Age of Empires 2 is that the defender's advantage is extremely high at the start of a game, but tapers off considerably as the game progresses. A town center is almost impossible to kill in the Dark Age, but it's hardly a threat at all by the Imperial Age. Swordsman line units are sort of the opposite. Militia only trade evenly against villagers with loom, but a medium-sized group of champions can chop down a town center if they have upgrades. The reason we tend to see them again in the late game is that their high food cost is finally sustainable. It may seem like it's their low move speed that holds them back, but I think it's actually their cost, although their speed is certainly a factor. This is interesting because on paper, swordsman line units are among the most cost-effective in the game. This is why I consider them among my favorite units in the game, despite arguably being the most generic units in any RTS game ever, at least in terms of what they are. That is, slow, average strength melee units with no abilities. What interests me most about RTS games in the first place is economic management, not fancy micro. I point this out because I really want Castle Age Longswordsmen to work, and towards the end of this video, I'm going to try to figure out a way to make it sort of work, even if it's not truly viable. The way I see it, there are two main reasons that we don't see Castle Age Longswordsmen, but they have many implications. They're expensive, and they're not particularly threatening. You might be wondering what I mean when I say they're expensive, since they're obviously way cheaper than knights, which are of course staple Castle Age units. Well, the reason I say they're more expensive is that they're a food-heavy unit, and at this stage of the game, food is much harder to gather a lot of than the other resources. Non-Gothic Longswordsmen cost 60 food and take 21 seconds to build, so they require around 171 food per minute to sustain. Using the values found in Spirit of the Law's video on sustaining unit production in the Feudal Age, that means they require 8.68 farmers to sustain from 1 barracks without wheelbarrow, 7.8 with wheelbarrow, and 7.15 with handcart. For knights, which only require 120 food per minute, those numbers are 6.09, 5.48, and 5.02 respectively. Although it's true that knights have a pretty high gold cost as well, they're also quite a bit stronger and more versatile. In particular, they do well against crossbowmen, the other staple Castle Age unit, which longswordsmen obviously do not. In order to trade effectively against knights with longswordsmen, you would need to have a pretty substantial numbers advantage, which would entail well over double the number of farmers required to sustain the equivalent number of knights. Remember that in order to gather that amount of food efficiently and safely, you'll need multiple town centers, which will cost you wood and stone, and that this is all food you're not spending on villagers. You also need to research both the Men-at-Arms and Longswordsman upgrades for a total of 300 food and 105 gold, just for the esteemed privilege of training them in the first place. not to mention the fact that you're probably going to have to grab wheelbarrow and ideally also handcart to gather the food you need efficiently. There's another 475 food and 250 wood. You'll also need the armor upgrades if you want any chance of surviving arrow fire, another 300 food and 100 gold, and you'll probably want squires, arson, and the attack upgrades too. That brings the total upgrade cost up to 1,220 food, 250 wood, and 375 gold, and that's before making any actual longswordsmen, which cost even more food. So yeah, if we're going to use longswordsmen in the Castle Age, although it already seems apparent that we shouldn't, it's probably going to have to be a larger scale late castle push. The other issue with longswordsmen is that they aren't a huge threat in the way that knights and crossbowmen are. This is mostly due to their slow move speed. Everything that they're good against can kind of just run away. Eagle warriors, skirmishers, pikemen, light cavalry, camels, even villagers. But there's a deeper implication to this. Unlike knights and crossbowmen, which can be quite effective on their own, longswordsmen need the support of other units to do what they do best. Without the support of siege and trash units, you probably won't be able to get much done, particularly if your opponent walls off well, and if you do support your longswordsmen with siege and trash, you'll be spreading yourself pretty thin. This goes back to the first problem. Swordsman line units need a large economy to support. So if we're going to find a way to use longswordsmen in the Castle Age with a civilization other than Goths, who should we pick? The obvious choice would be the Malians, with their infantry pierce armor bonus, cheaper buildings, and all-around solid tech tree. With the armor upgrades, Malian longswordsmen have a total of 5 pierce armor, which sort of turns them into a poor man's Huskarl, since they'll only take a maximum of 2 damage from enemy crossbows if your opponent has Bodkin arrow. I think the next best choice would be the Vikings. The extra infantry HP is great, but the real reason is the free wheelbarrow and handcart. The saved resources and ability to gather more food faster should allow you to sustain your unit composition that much earlier. With weak cavalry and monks and no gunpowder, the Vikings don't have terribly many other options on land maps anyway, especially in the Imperial Age. An honorable mention goes to the Burmese with their +2 attack and free lumber upgrades, which makes it easier to research wheelbarrow and handcart earlier. Regardless of which civilization you pick, I think the best bet would be to open with a defensive drush into fast castle with a blacksmith and archery range. This is especially true if you pick Vikings, so that you can start reaping the benefits of free handcart as soon as possible. Some number of defensive skirmishers or pikemen might be necessary, and possibly even a defensive mangonel or two. Either way, you're going to have to wall carefully, and be sure not to box yourself in too much. Although you won't need too much gold, you'll need the space to make enough farms to pull this off. Taking stone probably isn't a bad idea either. A castle on the front would certainly help you buy the time you need, although to be fair, at that point you should probably just make Gebettos or Berserks instead of longswordsmen. But hey, I never said this would be viable. The best time to attack is probably somewhere between 25 and 30 minutes, after you've had time to boom off of 2 or 3 town centers for a while and research the necessary upgrades. When you hit hard, bring villagers, and go for the Doubt Castle. It's kind of your only hope. If your opponent goes for knights, put pikes inside of rams and play peekaboo. I don't know, something. This build sucks. Anyway, the moral of this video is that you should probably just make villagers and crossbowmen or knights like a normal person. Longswordsmen require an insane amount of food, upgrades, and support to be effective, and they still aren't threatening enough to be worth the bother. As much as I love swordsman line units, they require an empire to sustain, and at this point in the game, your civilization is at best an independent city-state. That's all for this video. Thanks for watching. If you enjoyed it, please consider rating, commenting, and subscribing. It really helps. See you soon.